Eugene Delacroix is one of the great Romantic painters, an artist who wrestled with the revolutionary politics of 19th century France, who added an exotic, oriental dimension to European art, and who inspired a late flourish in history painting whilst playing a major role in the development of modern art.
Eugene Delacroix was born on the 26th of April, 1798, just outside Paris. His father, Charles, was a lawyer and a politician, and his mother came from an illustrious family of cabinet makers. But there's a certain mystery surrounding his birth, because a rumour flew around that in fact his real father was the celebrated politician and statesman Maurice Talleyrand, although nothing was ever proved. When Delacroix was just 7, Charles, his father, died.
He left a considerable sum of money to his wife, but through financial mismanagement, she left her family with almost nothing on her death 9 years later. Eugene, now an orphan, moved in with his elder sister and her husband.
Despite the setbacks, Delacroix managed to get into a good school in Paris, where he won prizes for classics and for drawing, enabling him to enter the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts and to study the work of the old masters at first hand just over the river in the Louvre. In the 19th century, the salon was the place where every artist wanted to exhibit his, or occasionally her, work. The selection jury there could make or break careers, but success led to public and private commissions. The salon was held every 2 years up to 1833. From then on, though, it was an annual event. In the summer of 1821, Delacroix decided he was ready for the salon, and he began work on a picture which was accepted by the jury the following April. It's called The Bark of Dante, and is taken from the great poem by the late medieval Florentine poet Dante, who has this poetic journey from hell through purgatory to paradise. And what Delacroix takes is hell and the inferno. The bark is the small boat in which Dante himself is sighted, clad here in red, with an amazing expression of surprise and terror on his face. And next to him is his accompanist, the great Roman poet Virgil, who has this serene expression on his face with a laurel leaf on his head. And then next to them, with his back turned to us, is the boat keeper from the river Styx, Phlegeus, who is struggling to get through this lake that surrounds the infernal city of Dis. And all around, the damned are trying desperately to be saved and to get aboard the boat. The inspiration for the work, Dante, was oddly enough rare in French art, even though Dante had fueled Italian art for the previous 5 centuries. No major French salon painter had ever attempted this subject matter. But of course, the real inspiration for this subject is clear. It's Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, and the drama and the lighting and the subject matter of figures struggling to get on board a boat. But I think what also struck the contemporary eye, and certainly what strikes us looking at the work, is the detailing, not just the expressions, but look at the way that colour's used. Now, Delacroix becomes one of the great colourists in Western art, but here it's very subtle, particularly in the way that the droplets of water are painted, where instead of using the usual greys, he uses a mixture of red and green and yellow and white. What he says is the palette of creation, the rainbow, rather than the muted colours that have usually been used. And this work was acquired by the French state, and the reaction critically was one of astonishment rather than admiration. But nonetheless, the feeling was there that here was the next young talent in French art. Shortly after completing The Bark of Dante, Delacroix began to keep a journal, leaving us an extensive and fascinating insight into the workings of the artist's mind. I am carrying out my plan, formulated so many times, of writing a journal. A writer has to say almost everything in order to make himself understood. But in painting, it's as if some mysterious bridge was set up between the spirit of the persons in the picture and the beholder. We ought to steep ourselves from time to time in great and beautiful works of art. Delacroix now organised all his attempts to make great and beautiful works of art with the salon in mind. The next one was scheduled for 1824. And this was the work that Delacroix exhibited. Larger, bolder, brasher than The Bark of Dante, and entitled Scenes from the Massacres at Chios. Now, Chios was a Greek island that had recently been attacked by the Turks after the Greeks had proclaimed independence in 1822. And what had happened was that 90,000 inhabitants on this island had been subjected to over 2 months of burning, pillaging, looting and raping to the extent that there were less than 1,000 left. The rest had been killed or deported for slavery. And Delacroix had both read contemporary newspaper accounts and also interviewed eyewitnesses, but in the end, that was a springboard for his imagination. The painting's dominated by the figures in the foreground, who are all the Greeks who are awaiting death or slavery. They all seem to be paired up, from the woman crying, leaning on the shoulder of the man who's been injured, to perhaps the most touching scene, the young child searching for his mother's nipple for nourishment while his mother lies dead. Again, one of the noticeable things about the painting is this detail and colour, not least in the red around the old woman's eyes, flecked with green. It's complementary. And then look at the shadow on her arm. Red once again, but again flecked with green. But then there's the drama of the Turk on horseback, dragging off this woman whose clothes are falling from her, as a young Greek man tries to protect her. And then we move to the middle ground, where there's another massacre taking place, where the Turks are there with guns and swords, killing a group of Greeks. And then in the shadows, we notice the spectre of the Turkish guards holding their guns. And so what we have is a scene of individual episodes brought into one, where ultimately everything seems utterly chaotic. And the critical reaction to the work was, on one hand, people said this was the new wild man of French art, and others said Delacroix has massacred painting. And this work helped to polarize the situation in France. There became a battle, if you like, between classicism and the art that had been put forward by people like David, idealness, beauty, order, harmony, and its antithesis, romanticism, the subversion of classicism, naturalism, emotion,